¿qué tal? Estamos en este show especial para CAF, en este Foro Económico Internacional de América Latina y el Caribe. Es un espacio de televisión para hablar con los protagonistas de este encuentro. Ahora tenemos al profesor James A. Robinson. Él es el ganador del Premio Nobel de Economía del año 2024. Professor Robinson, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Allow me start by asking you about the main concept, the main concern in our region. What is the difference between inclusive societies, institutions, and the ones that are extractive institutions, and the implications in our democracy and development?
Well, I mean, by institutions, I just mean the rules that societies create to govern themselves. And inclusive institutions are those that create broad-based patterns of opportunities and incentives. And extractive institutions concentrate opportunities and incentives in the hands of a few people.
Yeah, and the implications for the economy and for development, what are the implications of each one?
To have a dynamic, innovative, entrepreneurial economy, you need to have inclusive institutions, because you have to let all of the latent talent in the society come to the top. With extractive institutions, most people are blocked from becoming entrepreneurs, from getting a loan, to having property rights, and that creates poverty not just for them, but for everybody.
You have lived and studied several countries here in Latin America, like Bolivia, like Colombia, and like Venezuela as well. Okay, they seem to play at capturing the state for their own benefit. If it's possible to break the tendency of extractive institutions in our countries?
Well, I think it's difficult, but I think there's quite a few Latin American countries that have been much more successful than others. Costa Rica, Panama, Chile, Uruguay. They don't have the same. They still have many problems, but they made a lot of progress relative to, say, Colombia or Bolivia or Venezuela or Argentina. So I think there's a lot of differences between different parts of Latin America. I think generally, you still have enormous problems with extractive institutions in the subcontinent.
And what patterns have you observed in these countries that are doing this great job to encourage the other countries to do the same?
Well, I think they managed to really consolidate a kind of democracy, inclusive political institutions. You think about Costa Rica. They abolished the army in the 1940s. They've had very persistent democratic elections. Uruguay, after the dictatorship in Chile, after the transition from the dictatorship, which is when Chile really begins to flourish economically. It's in the last 35 years. There's been very democratic, non-clientelistic politics. So I think you see all of those countries that have been successful have managed to make this transition to more consolidated, sustained, non-clientelistic democracy.
Can you differentiate extractive institutions in democratic countries and the ones that is in dictatorships like Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua? Is there any difference?
Between
the extractive institutions, but in democratic systems or in authoritarianism?
No, I mean, there's huge differences. I mean, the poorest countries in the Americas are, the ones you named, Cuba, which has had highly extractive institutions for decades now, Venezuela, which had a long tradition of extractive institutions, of the role of the military, very corrupt, clientelistic politics, and then the state was captured by the Chavistas. There's different sorts of extractive institutions. You could say, well, those types of extractive institutions are very different from the types of extractive institutions that you have in Colombia, where, you don't have a dictatorship, you even have a left-wing government, but the economy is controlled by very few people. There's enormous monopolies, barriers to entry. There's huge corruption in government contracting. You have a lot. So that's very different from what you have in Cuba or what you have, under the Daniel Ortega's government, for example, in Nicaragua.
Yeah, and maybe the difference is freedom, or not.
I think the difference there is sort of ideological differences and historical differences. But for me, freedom, that's what creates wealth and prosperity and innovation and entrepreneurship, and but that's what you don't have in those countries. But there's a lot of gray areas. Colombia is a much more democratic place, than Venezuela, but there's still a lot of extractive institutions in Colombia.
As journalists, I can notice that sometimes people who live under extractive institutions, they don't even know that they are under these unfair rules.
Yeah.
In democratic situation, of course, not in dictatorships, of course.
Yes.
How can societies be aware of that situation, to wake up and face that in order to change it?
Well, I think that's where ideas are where the role of academics and the role of research and the role of an institution like CAF is so important, because what I see in Colombia is exactly, there's all these extractive institutions, and, in some sense, the government of President Petro is a response to that, but he has a totally spurious interpretation of the problems in Colombia. He has a out-of-date, outmoded interpretation. He thinks you can solve the problems by agrarian reform, and so that's where ideas are very important. That's where an institution like CAF is so important in trying to communicate what we know about these problems of development, what we know about the solutions, and trying to communicate that so that citizens can make more informed decisions. I think it's the same in the United States. There's a lot of problems and a lot of people are suffering, they're unhappy, they're looking for solutions, and lots of people are providing solutions which are not real solutions at all.
That's true. Let's talk about justice independence, judicial independence, because this is a very big point. When country has independence, justice independence, they can guarantee to their people some kind of justice.
Yes.
When not, it's like to push the self-destruct button in economics as well.
Yeah. No, I think, this is possibly the most fundamental institution in society. If you read John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, written in the 17th century, which is the kind of blueprint for the modern liberal state, when Locke talks about why do we have a state, it's exactly about the provision of impartial justice. That's the role of the state. That's the most fundamental role of the state. And without that, nothing else follows. Democracy doesn't follow, prosperity doesn't follow. So that's absolutely fundamental.
What do you think about these kind of meetings like CAF, this meeting of that make us to think about development, and what do you think the role of CAF in Latin America in order to help to reach some development in our region?
Well, I think it has multiple roles. It's a development bank, so it provides resources, which can help people invest and build businesses and help governments build infrastructure. But I think it also has a very crucial kind of knowledge role. CAF is a kind of knowledge bank, like many other things like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. And, we've been talking about how actually important these ideas are, communicating to people. And I also think, CAF, what I see about real economic success stories is there's an absolute obsession with the economy and with getting the economy going, with economic growth, getting everybody focused. If you look at these East Asian miracle countries, there's this absolute focus on, economic growth. And I think CAF is can really help explain to people, how to prioritize, and I think so it's a very valuable role.
I have a question about Venezuela. After Maduro's extraction, removal by the United States forces, do you see any path of recover institutions like justice, or economy in the country that have the largest oil reserves in the world.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any path to
No.
do that right now?
Why would there be? I mean, the United States has reverted to a kind of pre-1990 foreign policy. You know, if you think about how the United States interacted with Latin America, you know, in the 1950s or 1960s or 1930s, you know, it was the United States that supported the government of Rafael Trujillo in the República Dominicana, who supported the Somozas, you know, who created the Somozas in Nicaragua, you know, who overthrew the government of Arbenz, President Arbenz in Guatemala. You know, so we're back to that mode of interaction with Latin America, and that was not good for governance in any of those countries. And I think this, to me, the logic of leaving the Chavistas in power fits very well with that model. So I don't think that's a model which is going to build better institutions in Venezuela, as it did not build better institutions in any of those other countries.
What should be the Venezuela's future?
Well, you know, I think you look at history, you know, look at the Dominican Republic. You know, the Dominican Republic suffered a lot, but now it's built something different. You have to be patient, you know, you have to it takes time. I mean, I think it takes time for the United States to understand, actually, this is a really short-sighted foreign policy, and it's not good for anyone, including the United States, by the way. Having a prosperous Latin America is what is good for the United States. Prosperous, democratic, successful, dynamic, that is what's good. And that's a lesson that's been forgotten.
Professor Robinson, thank you so much.
Okay.
We appreciate a lot
My
having
pleasure.
you here. And Latin America deserves human development,
Yes.
not only economy,
Yes.
human
Yes.
development.
Yes.
Thank you so
Yes.
much.
Of course.